Well, good evening, and thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Jamie Gillies, and I'm the Executive Director of the Frank Mckenna Center for Communications and Public Policy here at St. Thomas University. Can everybody hear me in the audience? Great, thanks. Welcome to tonight's event. The land on which we gather is the unceded traditional territory of the Wolastoqiyik, whose ancestors, along with the Mi'kmaq and Passamaquoddy, signed peace and friendship treaties with the British Crown in the 1700s. The Frank Mckenna Center was established in 2012 and is host to an annual speaker series, student scholarships, faculty research grants, symposiums, and policy forums, and offers students and our community access to real-life policy activities. On occasion, the center is also able to bring notable leaders and experts to campus to speak with our students, faculty, alumni, and community. Tonight is one of those occasions, and may I say what an honor it is to host Dr. Stephen Ward, who is also my next-door neighbor. Before we formally introduce our speaker, I would like to acknowledge the support for this event from St. Thomas University, in particular Ashlyn Henry and the communications team here at STU, who have been tireless in their efforts to help organize and coordinate this event, and St. Mary's University, and the host and sponsor of tonight's event, the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, Chris Stover, to introduce our distinguished speaker for this evening.
Thank you, Jamie. First, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here at St. Thomas. Welcome. So I really appreciate it. As Jamie mentioned, I'm the executive of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, or CEPA, as we like to call it. It's the center of St. Mary's University, located in Halifax, created in 2002, in an effort to keep the consideration of ethics alive and well in public dialogue. The CEPA isn't an advocate of any cause, issue, or theme, but it exists to get us all considering a variety of perspectives on any given issue where we have confusion or tension around the right or wrong ways to think or feel or behave about any given topic. We do this through a variety of different ways. Presentations like this, in the collaborative model, work with a wide variety of groups and organizations. We've got more than 100 programs, video programs like this archived on our website. So if this kind of thing interests you, it's the cepa.ca. You can see all kinds of topics similar to this one. A few months ago, ironically, we were talking about what we were going to do in the upcoming season, and we were discussing how we would present our current concerns about fake news or about how we think about the news that we do consume. And a random email showed up in my box from Stephen Ward, a journalist who wondered if the CEPA took its show on the road and would we consider doing this very theme in Frederick. So here we are. So now a little bit about Stephen. Dr. Stephen J. A. Ward is an internationally recognized media ethicist, journalist, educator, consultant, keynote speaker, and award-winning author of 9 books on media ethics. He lives here in Fredericton, is an alumnus of St. Thomas, and having received the Distinguished Alumni Award from the University in 2016. He has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Waterloo in Ontario and a master's degree from the University of Toronto. He recently joined the STU Board of Governors and is currently teaching ethics in journalism and communications program. He is also a distinguished lecturer on ethics for the University of British Columbia. A former war reporter, he is also the founding director of the Center for Journalism Ethics at the University of Wisconsin and the co-founder of the UBC School of Journalism. He is the former director of the George S. Turnbull Center in the University of Oregon School of Journalism. Where aren't you? He is the author of the award-winning books Radical Media Ethics and The Invention of Journalism Ethics, as well as Global Journalism Ethics ethics and the media, and the global media and ethics. He has 2 new books, Disrupting Journalism Ethics and Ethical Journalism in a Populist Age. Stephen was a war correspondent, foreign reporter, and newsroom manager for 14 years and has received a Lifetime Award for service to professional journalism in Canada. He covered conflicts in Yugoslavia, Bosnia, and Northern Ireland, amongst others. He's been the BC Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press in Vancouver. He is the founding chair of the Ethics Committee of the Canadian Association of Journalists. The Canadian Association of Journalists recognized Stephen Ward with a Lifetime Service Award for Canadian journalism. Please join me in a very warm welcome for Dr.
Good evening. How are you? Thank you for coming. Hello to everybody online. Hopefully you're warmer than people out on the streets of Fredericton. It's great to be here tonight. I have picked an incredibly intimidating topic, populism, demagoguery, fake news, and what journalists should do about it. Is, in fact, a new topic that I decided to write on a couple of years ago. There are people online in this university who know way more about me, about politics and about anthropological issues of society. I'm going to be speaking to you as an ethicist, philosopher, who's going to ask about how do journalists do their most important democratic work in the environment we have. And this quote from Brecht is one of my favorites. All power comes from the people, but where does it go? That's exactly the problem with populism. It's easy to say, up with the people, right? Or if you're an elite, get down with the people. No, up with the people. People should govern. Government should represent people. But how does that happen? Who takes control of that process? Where? Well, where does the power go? The many issues that I'll be talking about tonight are reflected in this slide. It's only one of 3 major issues in what I regard as in ethics today, or media ethics. First of all, of course, media going global, and how do we report on global issues and global wars and all those new global responsibilities we never had. Also, the creation of digital media for everyone, where people can opine and, yes, disinform. And the big question is, if journalism is going to be so interpretive these days, does anybody know what a good interpretation is? Does anybody in journalism ethics, has anyone written about that? And how do we test information? I'm focusing, although this is related to this, I'm focusing on this, the notion of extremism, intolerant groups in media with particular purposes. And again, how I respond. The context I'm talking about, I'm assuming I don't have to go much into this. You are aware of this. You live it every day. You hear about it every day. But yes, disinformation in the public sphere, conspiracy theories, demonizing enemies or people as enemies. And what I want to stress, this is not just for fun or entertainment. There's people with very serious political goals, and that's why they're doing this. And that's why we have to take it seriously. So you have extremism, you have intolerance, you have people with rigid ideologies, you have everybody writing about the new authoritarianism that's coming up, so on and so forth. And you're very well aware of the nasty players, right? If you take a position online, like pointy-headed professor like me or someone else more important than me, just wait for the terrible emails to come rolling in. The fake video makers, the new ability of computers to make videos that you will probably not be able to tell with the naked eye that it is fake very soon. And the American military is spending millions trying to figure out how do you actually figure out what's fake. The divisive politicians, the fake populists, and support for democracy. There's many studies showing a worrying decline around the world in people's support for democracy, while there seems to be a fair amount of support for intolerance in the world. So for me, it threatens democracy, but not just any kind of democracy. It threatens my favorite form, which is egalitarian democracy, which requires reliable data, tolerance, pluralism, respect, compromise, dialogue, all that good stuff, right? All that civil stuff that we're supposed to actually agree to. And that is the culture of democracy. When you undermine that, you start to undermine the very basis of the practice of democracy. And that's my worry. Ask yourself, as you look at this, forms a very simple diagram of forms of public debate between a zone of respectful speech and a zone of disrespectful speech. Where under this, of course, you can have agreement and reasonable agreement. And over here, you can have something much worse, all the way to hate speech. Ask yourself, where do you think, overall, the dialogue in our society or around the world is going? In what direction is it headed? So the question for journalism ethics I want to pose is, yes, how do we respond? And particularly, how do we promote those values of egalitarian democracy that I just pointed out? And that's what I'm going to try to suggest a few ideas, only a few ideas tonight. No one has the full answer on this. Take it from me. How do we actually care and respond for caring about facts and refusing politics become a war and a tribal form of tribalism? My reply in the most simple terms is there's two big tasks that at least we can start doing as journalists, but also in league with citizens, not just journalists alone. One is try to detox the corrupted and polluted channels of information right now that's going on. What can we do about that? It's fine for you to for all of us to shake our heads and say, isn't it awful, all that fake news? Well, okay. Is there anything specific we can do to sort that out and help the democracy and citizens figure what is reliable and true? And the second one is educate. And I simply don't mean educate journalists, but educating the public themselves about how to use media and how to judge and critique it. And I think that's really key. We give them the tools to do that. So, yes, there are many tests. I think in fulfilling those two tests, journalism ethics is going to have to change in a number of ways. I'll leave it to you to decide whether there's a big change needed or a small change needed. But I think we start thinking, as I'll talk about, how we as journalists might rethink our role in society, at least in respect to these problems and how we come at them. I think we need new guidelines, and I think we also have to help create society-wide efforts to help talk. So that's basically what I'll be going into in the rest of my talk. The source of my interest in this topic is because I'm what is called a cosmopolitan in ethics. Basically, I believe that global values are primary, and that moral task is to reduce racism and intolerance and all those bad things, plus a global transformation of journalism ethics. But I won't be getting into that tonight. That's a whole other topic. From experience, though, it is my gut experience as a war reporter that I've been thinking about this implicitly for 25 years, since I was a war reporter, and I saw countries supposedly reasonable, supposedly democratic, supposedly going all right, a nice, beautiful veneer of civilization, right, wrapped over that society, just boom, just collapse into tribalism, war, killing, where neighbors who once were neighbors with other people, like Jamie and I, the next day are killing each other and calling each other rats, scum, and whatever. How the hell did that happen? I didn't know as a reporter, and I'm not particularly sure I know today. But that's the stimulus. I've been worried about, is civilization just that little tiny veneer over human beings who are really, really Darwinian creatures underneath, who have a part of darkness? They smile, right? And so that was the experience that drove me to this topic to finally, at this point in time, to get around it right. I want to sort of get into, I have to spend a little time defining what I mean by populism. Definitions being a philosopher's pastime, and I don't want to bore you too much with definitions. So there are so many definitions of populism that we could go into. I'm going to actually simplify. Please excuse me for the simplification. First of all, I'm going to talk about populism as simply the belief that the most important thing in society and what government should pay attention to is the needs and desires and interests of the common people. Right? Against what? Against powerful elites who would use government and power to satisfy their own interests. That's one of the ways people define it, the sort of manicure and two types of people in the world, the elites, the populist people, usually meaning common, meaning the lower classes or the less wealthy, And that's one way to define populism. From that definition, you can see that it's pretty thin as an ideology. That, in fact, it can go in so many different ways. Here's one way you could vary that definition. It depends on who you think the people are. If you define the people as only whites, not Jews, and not blacks in our culture, and you said, populism for the people, oh, by the way, what I mean by people is a subclass of all citizens and denizens of this country. What you've done there is taken on a sort of an extreme, sort of far-right definition. And so you get forms of populism where people actually say, we are populists. They actually mean we're populists for a certain group within society. But you can get much more democratic and perhaps more pleasing to the ear definitions by saying, no, what I mean by people is the great plurality of different types of people in the country. I mean all of them. And so you sort of have a more pluralistic definition of populism. So that's one source of variation in the definition. The other one is basically your view of elite. You can take a very hard, excuse my language, hard-ass attitude that all elites are corrupt, that all powerful people are out to get the common person, so on. That's a very extreme sort of antagonistic view, cynical and suspicious, very much. The other view is more moderate. It simply says, well, every country has to have elite. Someone's got to run the country. And all I'm saying is that we have to make sure we keep it accountable. Now, that's a much milder source of populism, right? So these are the why people say there's so many ways in which you can define that. If you look at the history of demagogues from Cleon in ancient Athens, how many know your history? Perhaps the first demagogue, Marat, a French revolutionary journalist, maybe Hitler, who said he was going to be great because he could, quote unquote, move the masses, right? If you want to think about populists, think of the difference in political style. The difference between Bill and Hillary Clinton, where Bill had this populist touch. You could walk down the street in Vancouver and everybody would he had this touch. You could do it. And Hillary, no. She talked like a lawyer and just didn't have that particular common touch. But you could think of populism in People's Alliance in New Brunswick, right? Where you have what they call a rural populism. I suspect the people mostly involved there are rural people, right? Or you could have Doug Ford's platform up, and so on and so forth. So there are many people and many kinds of definitions that can go into here. And so I'm going to stick with that more simple one and try to work with that. If you look at features of extreme populism, the first is what I've just talked about, where you define the people in an exclusive, limited manner. For example, lots of people talk about we have our shared values in our group, and those people are our values. That's a very common line of argument in politics these days. Anti-pluralistic as a negative feature. A dogmatism. You find often people say, my political beliefs are populist, and they're self-evident, by the way. And if you don't see why they're so evidently true, you're either wicked, stupid, or an enemy of the state. I'm sort of exaggerating to be provocative, but it's a line of thinking that, in fact, those who disagree with you are not really fully rational or equal to your concern and respect. There is, of course, action is preferred by strong leaders over deliberation. Look, the answer's already known. Why are we talking? Why don't we just get on with it? Why all this messy democratic process? Means ends reasoning. The old thing about the ends justifies the means. And so in communication, so what if I lie? So what if I twist the truth? So what if I have a few fake facts? As long as I'm pushing the peanut forward towards the goal, the political goal. In extreme populism, you also have the view that the people has a will, a sort of mystical will that is one and homogeneous. That it can be known by populist leaders. They somehow divine this, what the people actually want, what's right for them. Apart from the hard task of political deliberation and debate. And of course, it comes with a very strong patriotism and a rightful dominance of that group. I had to mention Trump. I'm sorry, couldn't get away with it. I'll let you argue with me whether you think he's a demagogue or a pop. It's interesting, though, just to think of the strategies that are going on there. Number one, divide and conquer, obviously. We've seen that, right? That's what you do. Psychologically, any psychologist who is a psychologist of hate and division will tell you how it's done is you create an enemy. That's what you do. You divide. You need an enemy, whether it's the media or anyone else. Conspiracy theories and slogans, lying as advantage. That's actually sort of patriotic. I mentioned that. Suppress your critics, politicize institutions like the FBI or other institutions, attack the media. And then you have a communication strategy. I'm still trying to figure it out, and maybe some of you much smarter people out there can tell me what he's doing. Steve Bannon, whom I have absolutely zero respect for, excuse me, that's my bias, out in the middle, actually said something in an interview recently that I think is actually true. Because they asked him, well, why does Trump lie all the time? I mean, he doesn't have to. You know, he seems the economy is going well, and so on. And Bannon says, well, what they want to do in communication is, excuse the language, we want to flood the zone with shit. We want to flood it with half lies, maybe lies, don't know lies. Maybe Khashoggi was killed, maybe he wasn't. Maybe the Saudis did, maybe he did. And you overwhelm and minimize counter narratives, right? Or you just confuse people so they're not really sure what to believe. And you control the agenda through chaos. I really believe he loves chaos. He loves surprising people with tweets in the middle of the night, keeping us focused on him, and so on and so forth. It's not a very profound analysis, but maybe something to get going in the discussion. I want to turn now to what I call the functions of democratically engaged journalism. By democratically engaged journalism, I mean journalists who are committed to the egalitarian democracy I've just said. Right? I think I can describe it better a little bit later. I thought it might be easier if I just told you some of the things that I think journalists should do to be democratically engaged, rather than give you a sort of an abstract definition. So here are some of the things I think they should do. I think they should identify fake facts, and I think they should call out unreliable sources explicitly. I think they should not only question facts, they should question views, political views, where they in fact question democratic. I think they should challenge. I think journalists should challenge leaders that undermine democratic rights. I think they should oppose racial stereotypes, especially where we make others, like refugees, to be threats, not to simply repeat and amplify other people's demonization of people. And I think we need to challenge the language of demagogues and populists. If anyone ever calls themselves a populist, I hope you, if you are a journalist, your next question will be, what do you mean by being a populist? What does it mean to you to be a populist? What are your actual commitments? What are you going to do in the name of populism? So you have to know something about populism and so to be able to challenge it in those ways. I think also you need to report critically on extreme groups, not just like any other group. And that's really difficult. I think there, we don't really have really great guidelines in codes of ethics and journalism about how we're going to deal with, say if you had a white supremacist rally tonight somewhere in Frederick. I mean, how many journalists would feel that? Do we just go down and report, and just sort of do our normal job? Or do we have to come at it with care, much more care and criticality? So those are sort of the negative functions of trying to help detox the messages that are out there. But there's positive stuff too, where we actually commit ourselves to being what I call bridges of understanding. We're trying to get a conversation across the divide. We're not trying to report in ways that divide people. We're trying to find some way to find that bridge across the divisions. I call it deep political journalism. What do I mean by that? I think, in fact, in many ways, citizens of this country and the United States and maybe other countries don't really have a great grasp of what they mean by when they say, I'm a Democrat, or what our democracy is. They have a very good, clear grasp of what the principles are, why you need a division of powers, why you absolutely need an independent judiciary and you shouldn't be stacking them with your cronies, right? Why, in fact, you shouldn't tell the FBI to investigate only one person when it regards a candidacy for the Supreme Court. Why, in fact, it's really important to respect minority. Why that comes with the definition of egalitarian democracy. It's not extra. That's what makes a liberal democracy. And so all of these things for me is almost like we as citizens, not just journalists, we as citizens have to go back and take Political Science 101 with respect to this and remind ourselves of the interpretations of our key principles and what they mean. And that's not easy. Maybe it sounds obvious to you, but it's not to me. Deep cultural journalism. What I mean by that, we can decrease the xenophobia and fear of others to a great extent if we as journalists present the real face of pluralism in this country. And that means reporting extensively and deeply on all the people who don't normally get reported on extensively and deeply, and showing what these people are actually like. What do their religious traditions actually say? Who are these people, and do they have a human face? Right? Yes, they do. Yeah, and that is the sort of the cultural journalism. You know, once you meet people like that and see them, you know, it's much harder to demonize them. I could not demonize French people of New Brunswick when I grew up, because I grew up in a town where my best friends were French. We interacted every day. Similarly, today, I worry about New Brunswick. You know, one thing we learned from the election, it seems that we don't know a lot about how our political system works. What happens when we don't have a majority? Oh my God, we have to figure out, why does it go to the lieutenant governor? And what happens? Well, political education, right? But number two, in my view, and you can disagree with me on this, it shows this province is becoming increasingly divisive with divisions, north, south, French, and English. And so there's got to be a way in which civic groups and media can do a whole lot of journalism around not only this problem, but who we are, why do the French have certain services, and why is there dual school boards, and why not, and what's the arguments one way or the other. As sort of robust, but, you know, cultural journalism in that sense. I also think we need to create media spaces for robust dialogue rather than ranting. That's really, with the online presence, you think we could create spaces on there which feature more and more of that. And I think we need to assist the public media. So those are the sort of the functions, negative and positive, just some of them, that will give you an idea of what I mean by this sort of journalism. And it's already done by certain members of the media, but I'm arguing for sort of a much larger commitment to the form of journalism. Just a few lines on this methodological commitment to what I'm talking about. I'm actually arguing and saying, if you've noticed, the journalists will actually have to be way more active in their reporting, more interpretive in their reporting. That, in fact, they're going to have to take a stance against certain views. And so this, I'll get to the concerns with that in a second. But why would I say that? Well, I think when you come to journalism ethics, it's always a choice of what model of journalism you think is correct and proper. And there's no absolute decision here. It just depends on what sort of country you live in, what its particular media needs are at that time. What sort of engagement journalists should have depends on what's happening in the context of their culture at any given time. So, journalist engagement, the revolutionary journalist, the reform journalist, advocacy journalist, the narrow was the wrong word, but the straight reporter, sort of neutral type of reporting, that model, right? The investigative journalism model. There's always been a choice of what models you want to take up. And so it's not when I say, why don't you do DEJ type of journalism? It's not like, what I'm arguing is that pragmatically, is that this is right for this particular time. And that's the justification. And if it isn't, then I'm wrong. Also, journalism ethics is based on larger social philosophy. For me, no journalism ethics set of principles, for example, in any code. It doesn't exist in the abstract, apart from some context and some worldview. It has to go back to some sort of social or political philosophy. It exists within that point of view. So, for example, go look at the code of the Society of Professional Journalists in the United States, or even the CAJ here in Canada. Well, what do you get in the preamble? You get a political philosophy, a political justification for journalists. That is, to maintain freedom of expression, to support justice, to make sure democracy works good. You wouldn't get that in China, would you? Right? So that little aside, just to show you that there is a commitment, there always has been an engagement of journalists although we sometimes like to portray ourselves completely neutral on these matters. And so, yes, there is a political basis upon which almost all of our really big journalism arguments depend upon. And so for me, democratically engaged journalism is for egalitarian democracy. It is partial in its goals. It's partial in the sense that I would admit, as one of those journalists, I have goals. I'm not neutral. I'm not without goals. I'm not without values. I have a political value called egalitarian journalism, and I'm quite partial about it. But hopefully, in doing stories about it, I can apply a sort of an impartiality of method, and method and goals are different. And so, that I can't get into all this, but the epistemology here is basically, get your facts right, argue logically, make sure your views are tested by coherence with existing knowledge, run your views past other people, expose it to public scrutiny. And that's about as good as you can do in journalism. And that, in fact, is sort of the best methodology, hopefully in league with your commitment to democracy. There is, however, immediate concerns, like I said, this view where I want journalists to be more active in their philosophy and self-definition. The first thing is, what about objectivity as neutral reporting of just facts? What happened to that, right? And is this reporting just opinion or bias? How do you know the difference? Those two questions I've been asked many times. And what the asker seems to be wanting to do is to force me to make a choice between two types of journalism. A sort of neutral stenography of just the fact, where we don't have opinions, we don't put our perspectives, we pretend we don't put our perspectives in the news, right? Or you're partisan, and there's nothing in between. You're Sean Hannity of Fox News, partisan. And what I'm saying, there's got to be something. We need that to find that middle ground in our descriptions of ourselves. If we're going to respond to a toxic public sphere, we're going to have to be more active. And I can't see how adopting the very old view of complete neutrality is sufficient for reacting, just the facts. And the facts today are someone else's facts or alleged facts. Where, in fact, just knowing what the facts are, you're going to have to be completely active inquiry and investigator. So for me, this is a whole other lecture and argument about what does this all entail for journalism ethics. But I'm trying to find that third way where we're informed interpreters. We're engaged, but we're not simply biased and partisan. That isn't easy. It takes a lot of thinking. I also think that the sort of journalism I'm talking about, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do straight reporting. There's lots of stories where you just want the reporter to go down to a particular event, and basically interview some people and come back with a basic story. But that's only one form of journalism we need today. It's important. I did it for years, and no one's. I'm not questioning that. But I think there's other forms of journalism. For example, explanatory needs. So we need much more explanatory journalism that tells us what is going on here in very well-informed and deep and profound ways. You can get that not just in political journalism. You get that in science journalism too, if you just read scientific or whatever. Perspective enrichment, that's way too big a word, right? Perspectival enrichment. What I simply means by that is we also need in our journalism as many different informed perspectives as we can. We need, and I say this explicitly, we need avocational and reform journalism. It's not a bad word for me to say a journalist is an advocate. They're not necessarily biased and self-seeking and any of that. In fact, advocacy journalism has a very, very, very good moment, including the civil rights movement in the United States and elsewhere in the world. And reform and pushing for reform, that's something that some part of our journalism universe should have. And also participatory needs. I firmly believe that we now need to make sure that citizens can play a part in that dialogue. They are part of the journalism of our time. I have to go a little quicker here. And also dialogic needs were those dialogic spaces. Historically, in terms of history of journalism ethics, it is this square down here that has been prioritized and underlined. This is what is objective journalism. This is the journalism we mostly need. Just get the facts right. give it out to the public, let the public judge for themselves. I can get into the discussion, but almost every phrase I just used there is open for question right now, whether that actually do work today. And what I want to see is a much richer kit of journalism being done so we can enforce or support egalitarian democracy. So that's sort of the conceptual side of trying to change our head around how to think about what we're doing here as journalists. There is a practical side. And in the book that I've written, I try to provide some guidelines. One of the ones that I find, I sort of tongue-in-cheek called it Ward's Index on How to Spot a Demagogue. And basically, I basically thought it'd be a great tool for a teacher or for anyone to simply go through my 8 tests. And ask yourself whether any particular leader fits, how well does it fit with the criteria by which you judge whether they're a demagogue or they're not, or they're not a threat. So I do provide a whole bunch of things. Let me just take a couple. Procedures and opponents. For me, one of the things you always need to watch out for in a leader is how they portray and treat their opponents. If they debase them, they treat them like enemies, they say lock them up, and so on and so forth. You need to be very careful at that point. There's authoritarian sort of bubbling up in such attitude. So you can use that as part of your litmus test to be worried about. Strategies for work in the system. If the leader says we're going to, he doesn't say it, but he starts to politicize the basic institutions, the law enforcement agencies, the courts, the media, and so on, politicize in the sense of making sure it operates according to his rules and according to his people, then you have trouble. Attitude to violence and authoritarianism. How does the leader think about other non-democratic countries and human rights violations in them? I think that's a good test. Is he or she willing to explicitly not condemn such human rights violations? Or it's sort of like, well, it's business. We have business connections with people, and maybe it's bad, maybe it's terrible, but they're not so bad after all. But what I'm trying to point out is that attitude is another little bell that should go off. And there's other ones, right? The impact on culture that they're having, and whether, sort of divisiveness, spread of divisiveness. I don't want to go on too much about everything that I got in the book. In terms of extreme speech, I think that there's no general duty to report on everything they do and everything they say. What we do have a duty for is to try to inform responsibly on these groups where they become powerful or significant factors in society. And so I have a list of questions, and there's a whole bunch of sub-questions that actually every journalist should ask themselves when they're covering such groups, including, of course, the aim of the speech, the affiliation and nature of the group that's involved, their financial coverage, what they've said in the past, their reliability with respect to truth and facts. Then you have tough coverage choices, as I'm sure Harry and the other journalists I see out there know about, that even if you decide that this group needs to be covered, because they're having an impact on an election, or they've grown in public support polls, then you still have to ask about, well, what are you going to use? Which symbols are you going to use? Are you going to use them over and over again? What is proportionality in these cases? Now, I can't write a manual for that. All you can ask is that journalists use their innate sense of fairness and journalism to decide those questions. And I also add some other things, the impact and harm that the report will do, and the prominence you want to give it. So these are some of the guidelines, I think, just a work in progress in my view, that we need to develop. And we can do so, for example, in journalism societies and all over the place. There are also, globally, incredible amount of work going on and trying to come up with new guidelines for journalists covering these very tough global issues. And one of the leading groups is the Ethical Journalism Network in London. They go around the world meeting with journalists, getting journalists from different groups, different political divides to come together and try to talk about how to cover terrorism, how to cover immigration, how to cover hate speech, climate change, and so on. There's a lot of work going on, and if you're a journalist today or a teacher of journalism, you can certainly pick this up and discuss it in your classes very much. So there's positive stuff. Apart from the guidelines, I want to come to sort of the last part of the talk. This is the part where, yeah, okay, we're going to sort of get straight about the philosophy of journalism. Oh, yeah, and then we're going to try to develop some good guidelines to help practice. Oh, okay, that's all internal journalism. That's not enough. It's not enough to be internal changes. It's good, great. We want internal reform within our discipline. Of course we do. My view, however, is that this problem of, demagoguery and detoxing and all that is way bigger than what journalism as an institution or society. And that, in fact, what we need is what I call macro resistance. This means macro resistance to what? To macro corruption. That, in fact, we need journalists have to join civic actors to develop media and to help citizens recognize the media that's out there and to detox the public sphere. Notice I said join. You're not allowed to join under a certain model of journalism. So this is controversial. But I think we have to become players with those civic groups we think can help us, help society. So we're assisting democratic society. There's three ways, at least three ways, that we can do it. One is awareness. Journalists can help the public become awareness of media ethics. They can help them critique media, and they can help them, and I think journalism themselves, journalism programs, communication programs, you can argue about this, they need to turn media programs outward and global. Let me explain what those three are. Improving awareness, it is really important that we develop what I call media ethics for everyone. This is beyond journalists, it is beyond journalism. What we need is norms for the, what's the right word? The ethical, the respectful use of media by all citizens. We're all users of media now. We all can do harm, from cyberbullying on to whatever, to pornography. And in many ways, media ethics for everyone is a question, where is that discussion happening? Where should it happen? Well, it's not happening enough. And it's not happening enough at universities, in my view. And so what I'm talking about here is that we journalists can help teachers, schools, and citizens in general try to define what that media ethics can be for citizens so they can use it in their own life, so on. I have something called public participatory journalism ethics. It's a big quite a phrase. What I simply mean is that journalism ethics has gone beyond the confines of journalism. It used to be what I call closed ethics. Journalism ethics was created by journalists, for journalists, altered by journalists, approved by journalists, for journalists, not for citizens. And in fact, in many ways, I remember writing code and people arguing that why should we even have people on the board? Why should we have citizens? Why should we consult citizens? What do they know about journalism? What do they know about the daily decisions and quandaries we come in? And it was this sort of almost arrogance that citizens shouldn't be part. Well, I think that's all gone. I was part of a code writing process for the Society of Professional Journalists. And they decided not to allow citizens to be part and parcel of the discussion of the altering of their norms. And what happened? We live in an age where people expect to be consulted and to participate. So behind, the committee, we did its work, and I said, you're going to be sorry. So we wrote the amendments. It went out to the great online world. What do you think happened? Citizens trounced, especially journalists who were not told and part of the process. They said, where in hell have you been doing this behind closed doors? Why didn't we get a voice to respond and be part of this process from the beginning? And in fact, so you lack credibility if you don't include the public in at least code exercises like that. So there is a necessary, there's other examples where they participate, but I can get into that later. Involving capacity to create, this is of course a fact-checking industry, virtual industry out there now. There's many, many fact-checking sites, some good, some bad. So you've got to be able to fact-check the fact-checkers, right? But there is some really good stuff out there, and I think that's all fine and good. that helps. But unfortunately, a lot of it is only known to journalists or used by journalists, and I don't think it's widely known among the broad public that they can go to cross-check or PolitiFact, stuff like that. But surely that's part of what I mean by DEJ. Proven capacity to critique. Here's something that I've been harping on for a little while with not much success, is that we have to have, if we want to assist society, what we need to be is part of helping schools and other groups, civic groups, launch media and democratic literacy projects. Here, media literacy is a very deep notion. It includes being able to recognize sources of news, where it comes from, reliability, and so on. But it also means how that ties in to democracy and public life. And I think that should start in grade 5. I don't know. Younger? Whenever young people start using media seriously, I don't have any kids, so I have no idea, right? And so we need to institutionalize to a certain extent, but also have it online where we impress media literacy. And as journalists, we're not running that show entirely, right? But we can assist. We have knowledge to extend. I think we should have it, basically we should have media literacy taught across the curriculum in university, not just in journalism school or communication. And that would help also. I won't get into marathon enough. I can't. Also, I think there are what I call coalitions, fancy word, coalitions for media. What I mean by that is that if we connect all the groups who care about media in our society, if we connect all the different resources we have, even in the United States too, there's enormous resources that we can bring together, help fact check, help develop webs and hubs where people can go to, and actually help them recognize crap from good stuff, right? Detox the public sphere in many ways. And so I think of webs of link centers to discuss this. Like what? Well, here's my very bad diagram. Sorry, I'm not good at these are just some of the people. I'm going to call it the Canadian Hub. I'm announcing tonight, Canadian Hubs of Media Accountability. S means there's probably going to be a whole bunch of them rather than just one. Look at all the people. We could have 3 great schools of journalism, St. Thomas, Ryerson, and UBC, across the country. Students could participate in these projects, right? We have academic publishers and associations. We have NGOs. We have centers for ethics. I know, I started one. the National Media Council. We can have a major fact checker. We can have centers for democracy, news organizations, of course, CBC, whatever, and so on. I'm not sure how that configuration should go together. I'm just saying the resources are there where we can start making a dent. We can actually have high-profile places where the public can go and learn about media and check things out. What would they do? Yeah, fact-checking, tracking of sources. I like the idea of creating a registry of reliable and unreliable sources. That could be a bit controversial in sort of some cases, but in a lot of cases it isn't. Why not have a certificate of reliability that news organizations say, yeah, we've been affirmed as a reliable, ethical news organization. Why don't we create technology? And I believe some of this is coming along, and the tech guys probably know better than me, where you have an actual app that you can put on your website, your news website, and tag it to stories. And all I have to do as a citizen is click the button, and it gives me the history of the story, who did it, their reliability, their past fact checking record, so on and so forth. One go. Make it that easy, and people will start clicking, right? If they have to go to fancy sites that only journalists know about or so on, they may not, right? So why not? It's a good challenge. I think we should produce schools of journalism, communication, academics generally. We can produce weekly digests on these hubs of the best research available on big topics. What's the hot topic of the day? Gun laws in Canada, right? Or new gun laws in Canada. Oh no, it's somehow another mass murder shooting. What's going on there? What Harvard does this, the Harvard Shorenstein Center already does this, and it's really terrific. They will say, journalists, according to our opinion and academic experts, these are the 5 must-read if you're going to report intelligibly on them. It's a great help for a journalist who's really in a hurry, as we always are. So there's all kinds of assistance we can give journalism in this way. I think we should do an annual State of the Media report on a whole bunch of issues with a map of the media. That's a big project, but that would be something worth doing, I think. And yes, media ethics for everyone. And I think we could provide teaching, how to teach media ethics, curriculum, so on and so forth. There's all kinds of things we can do. So why are we so despondent about this fake world, right? We have, look, I belong to an association of education for journalism and mass communication. It's the big one for professors, scholars, media. I think Jimmy probably belongs to it. In North America, how many belong in that association? Thousands and thousands of scholars and experts. And I go to their conferences and I keep saying, why couldn't we just use some of this intellectual strength to work on projects like this, right? Rather than going to paper after paper, which is only being given to get tenure anyway, on very, very minute topics that bore me to tears. Not all that, believe me, some of it. But that's my sort of provocative way of pointing it. So that's just an imaginary entity. It doesn't exist anywhere, but maybe we can make it help to realize. There are other coalitions to look for. Europeans are really big in these coalitions. For example, Get the Trolls Out, right? Which is basically monitoring media for trolls and fake news and all that. But not only do they have like Centers for Independent Journalism, they have things like Jewish students, Muslim women, right? And a variety of different groups coming together from London to Hungary to try to detox the public sphere, right? There's, in France, an effort to avoid radicalization of youth. Since 2015, they've been spending a lot of Euro dollars designing programs in schools. And part of it, which is interesting to me, is that they asked journalists to come into the schools as part of this program and explain the difference between their work and, say, the propagandists, between good journalism and bad journalism. And so journalists, again, active, engaged, right? Not standing back, watching the world go to hell. Not standing back, disengaged and saying, I'm just going to describe what happens in front of me, but actually trying to make a difference. And there's lots of other groups that we could talk about. In terms of journalism education, I think if we could get some of these coalitions and projects going, journalists, our students would have this great experiential learning, where they could actually learn by working to build coalitions, to build a fact checker, and so on and so forth. And I think that would help to break down, that's what I mean, like moving outward, seeing journalism moving out to society, sort of breaking down journalism stereotypes and showing the value of communication in journalism programs. And finally, I can't leave it go, but I would hope that there's increased stress on global education, global knowledge in our journalism programs. Look, I was head of a school of journalism. I know how tough it is to balance critical skills, technical skills, global education. I know all that. But I think we need to try our best to make that a presence in our programs. So there's one example from UBC where they have a global reporting center. And they were lucky enough to find a rich person who was willing to give money to the one course, investigative journalism course, foreign investigative course, take students around to another part of the world to do a big series of stories on a major issue. They do it every year in the second term. In the first term, they learn. They learn about the cultures they're going into. They learn from experts as much as they can. They try to learn how to frame the issues so they're not, sort of so westernized, they're biased. And the ethical issues they expect to occur when they go and try to interview people in cultures other than their own. So these are some of the positive things in the education. So let me sort of wrap up what I've talked about. I've talked about reform in 3 areas. One, ideology. That is, what the hell are we going to do as journalists? How do we see ourselves? Reform of practice, meaning new guidelines and critical practices. And yes, external reform, meaning external, where in fact we alter how traditionally schools have been seen themselves in society, place in society with greater involvement. That's external reality of society. That is, sort of where I am. What can we aim at imperfectly? Is this what I've said tonight, the ultimate fix? No, of course. There is ultimate. There's only a little progress at a time. and hard-won progress too. Even if every journalist, think of this, I'll make this thing. If magically, by some magic, what time is it now? 5 to 8. 5 minutes from now, at 8 o'clock, every journalist turned into a perfectly great reporter and ethical human being. I love the truck. That's fine. You can check out about it. Okay, right? That, in fact, it still wouldn't matter. It would not make, it would not solve all our problems because there are so many other players out there who are not ethical. There's so many other forces we're facing. You know, people say, why can't we just be nice and civil? You have no idea. There's huge forces raimed against being civil. Uncivility in certain contexts pay. And that's what you got to realize. You know, and it's not going to stop till it doesn't pay politically. So I think we can have a core of citizens and journalists who care about good media and democracy. And yes, we can push back. Maybe not perfectly, but push back against toxic fires. I think we can have a coordinated effort and hopefully a realism, but with ideals. I never want to get rid of ideals because they're a sort of target at which to aim at. So don't be despondent. Stuff we can do. Thank you very much.
To stand up at the microphone over there if you've got any questions, or stand up and I can bring this mic to you if you've got some questions for Stephen.
Sure.
Well, thank you for that lecture. Lots to think about there.
Thank you.
But when you say reporters have to get more engaged and active, that seems to be such a paradigm shift from the tradition where you're not supposed to be aligned with anybody at all. And in the world, we're becoming more polarized. And I say we, I think more of the states is the example there. You've got people who will discount or read or hear journalists based on whether their organization is considered left or right.
Okay.
So if they go the step you're suggesting and become more engaged, doesn't that just feed that polarization more?
It could feed more accusations of bias against media. But you're never going, and I think that shouldn't, but my point, I'll get back to the first point you made, but on this point, is that yes, what I'm asking will open up journalists and news organizations charges of bias by all over the political, you're right. And then you have to say, well, okay, is that enough not to do it? I don't think so. I think, in fact, you have to be prepared to fully answer such charges. Let me give you an example of how open it can be. In mid-September, The Current had a program on how a Russian dissident was apparently poisoned. They interviewed Bill Browder, who is to be a hedge fund manager in Russia. Now goes again, tries to combat human rights violations in Russia. It had, when you listen to the program, yes, it has one perspective. It has the family saying, yeah, this looks like a poisoning. Yeah, we need Canada because this person is a dual citizen and part Canadian. We need them to respond. I listened to it all. It did get people's, at least one person's strong reaction and complaint to the executive producer, BBC Woodsman, that this was bias. You shouldn't be putting such views on, since such views are, number one, views, and number two, they're not proven to be true. So the problem with that is that, if that is the case, then in fact most intelligent analysis of politics I don't know how you're going to do it, because it's going to have to come at it with some sort of slant on the story. I don't mean bias necessarily, but some sort of perspective. And the problem is that news managers and news bureaus are going to have to know that this is the new world they live in. Secondly, I guess my other point would be, well, what's the option? The option could be to stay with the very traditional model that you mentioned at the beginning. And I just can't see that being an effective model. I think for certain, again, I keep thinking for certain forms of stories, I think it's fine. Why do I think that? Is simply because it assumes that this old model that was basically in the early 1900s was created for a completely different media world than today. And the assumption was a very naive view of democracy. One, journalists or reporters could separate their biases and perspectives and drill down to a sort of sacred, pure set of facts in their story. A very strong psychological, somewhat dubious proposition, I would say. Number two, that in fact, if you did have the facts, all you had to do was transmit it out to the public. That's all you had to do. And then guess what? The public, who are reasonable, fair, will say, I'll just tally up the facts and change my view. Well, that's not what happens now, in a great part. In fact, it's the exact opposite. People are not reasonable. People are partisan. And in fact, belief forms facts, not facts forms belief. And so the first is the hallmark of an ideological of a rational human being. So what I'm saying is that you've got to realize that the democracy we live in requires journalists to become more active without falling into the camp of partisan. And I agree. I've written a lot on that, and I can't summarize the story, but it's that middle ground that we've got to find. And I don't deny that it is philosophical. It's a big challenge.
Lots of things to think about. I particularly like the idea of sort of coalitions, forming coalitions, civil society groups. But listening to this, of course, all that goes through my mind is this journalism we're talking about. This is a time when we're bleeding journalists from every publication, from every media in the country. So I'm just wondering how you see some of this coming to fruit when people are required to do more and more as journalists.
Yes.
And there's fewer and fewer of them, and the freelance people have problems with access.
Absolutely. Let's go back. A very good question. I'm not sure I can handle it adequately because there's a lot of things. That's why I put so many red squares. It can't, with cutbacks in newsrooms, with limited time in newsrooms, with lacking smaller and smaller budgets in the mainstream part of news media. Yeah, I think there's limitations to what they can do, but there's all these other folks who apparently, hopefully we can get in line. Students, of course, but all these other people who study media, who are committed to it, political scientists too, and so on and so forth. I guess my answer is that, yeah, you're right. I'm not sure, how you're going, whether you can persuade people to become part of it. But I do know that if we sort of separate the load, the workload as much as possible, it might be.
Thank you for that talk. I have a question about, I like what you're saying about activist journalism, definitely, and I would actually identify myself as one. The question I have is, how do they identify themselves, like in a bio? Because I know I saw a discussion recently in The Guardian where one side was advocating that journalists should even reveal in their bio how they vote, which, but if you're going to be joining groups or aligning yourself, like, do you have to list everything in your bio, or how do you give people a sense of where you're coming from?
I think you just put it. You need to give them a sense of your approach to journalism, whether you're sort of neutral or impartial, or your advocacy. Or you need to make that clear, and also make clear what that position is. Are you left, right, or whatever you come from? I don't think you need to give away everything about yourself, and certainly not how you vote. I don't think that's anybody's business. And so I think what you need, I think transparency requires you to describe the perspective you're coming from. That's the simple answer. One of the myths we have is that we've always had neutrality and impartiality, or especially neutrality, has been a great value of journalism. Well, let me push back on that. First of all, it's not neutrality. Impartiality is the right. But first of all, journalists have always struggled to be neutral in a very strong sense. Just the fact. They've always struggled. Secondly, some of the best journalism we've ever seen has been non-neutral journalism. Were the editors, the Washington Post, neutral when they went against Nixon to publish Pentagon Papers? No. I sit on two journalism award committees. You know who wins those awards? Not neutrality. The winners are people of active, engaged journalism who stop abuses in prison, who helped some poor group become against City Hall, and they're praised for their democratic engagement. They're praised for their activism. They're praised for what they're doing for their country. And then we turn around the next day and say, oh, well, we're going to be really neutral, and we've got to be stand back. And my point is that this is a fake, it's outdated. We've got to get something better description of who we are. And so that's why I think activism journalism, as long, my only qualifier in activist journalism is that you don't conceal facts from the public. You get so involved with your group that you're not willing to report facts for the public that they should know about your group. At that point, you're starting to lose your independence quarterly. Other than that, taking a position has been since the beginning of journalism. So I don't think we should be so afraid of it. All we should be afraid of it is, can we sort of build in ways in which we avoid, outright partisan steps. So, thank you.
I'll just add a question here from our online audience. Stephen, these are questions from the CSEPA website. This person asks, you said journalists should call out unreliable sources.
Yes.
Is it the journalist's role to immediately point out lies when confronted by a barrage of lies?
Not immediately. Do your homework and make sure you know. I'm not asking for every reporter on the National tonight to immediately say, and that was a lie, and by the way, the Minister of Agriculture was lying too. If it is, first of all, what you need to make sure is that that first of all, lying is intentional. So it requires a fair amount of evidence beyond simply making mistakes. Secondly, it takes time. You should do your own work on this and come back with it at a later story, perhaps an analysis later, or some other journalism, which basically says, you know what, this was a crock, and it seems to be a crock that was deliberately pushed. So yeah, my point is, I'm not envisaging every news report saying, liar, liar, pants on fire. I'm simply saying where it does occur, we shouldn't be afraid to do so. We shouldn't be so worried about our neutrality that we're not going to say it's a lie.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm curious about how you feel about rural journalism and how it's becoming non-existent.
Yeah.
And how it's how, especially here in New Brunswick, as a rural province, how things are being centralized an awful lot and urbanized, and the messages about that's coming from the region, either it's not heard or it's never presented. And like in this presentation, within this kind of environment and what's being proposed here, even their voices seem to be missing in a lot of this discussion. And I'm just wondering where that concept of small is beautiful, and where how we can engage and encourage and support that kind of journalism, that kind of activism within our society, mainly because it's the only real voices to be able to counter this populism that's being dictated from these urban centers by people that are very comfortable and trying to protect their comfort levels.
I think you're right. It is a huge problem, right? It is also usually lumped in or made part of the problem of what's called local journalism. There's been a huge local journalism, and I just saw a report, the United States, but the other day, where in fact the number, even the number of local newspapers, the lack of local, is having a detrimental effect on even accountability of local government. They're not being quizzed by local reporters like they used to be. I used to cover city council in Bathurst, right? And that's a very important thing to do. I mean, some people would snicker at it and say it's just Bathurst, whatever. But hell, that's it. Those issues mattered to the citizens of Bathurst. And I think there's a snotty attitude towards rural journalism or local journalism. How you get it back? There's been various proposals. Maybe we can do hyper-local internet, where neighborhoods and communities can create their own media. If the so-called mainstream media aren't going to do it, let's do it ourselves. I would support that. And maybe, in fact, some Center for Journalism would want to help those folks learn how to write story, how to do some journalism. There are some ways we can do that. I do worry, however, about whether the economic argument is there for that form of journalism. I would hope so. I mean, there's another form of journalism that is also, I think, could be bolstered. One is provincial government, or what's called state house government, where in fact we've cut back on a lot of coverage. You know, in a way, you might say, well, people are apathetic about politicians. They don't want to hear all that political stuff anyway. Yeah, but you're also allowing for a lot of stuff to go on. And when in fact, when good journalists leave a vacuum, you know who they're filled by? They're filled by the sort of biased partisan journalists or units that I'm very worried about. Happened in the United States. So I've just come back just 2 years ago. That's why I have all these examples in my head. There's also a great movement that hasn't really taken fire in Canada. I'm not, maybe it's because we're smaller. Everyone's a smaller population, but it's nonprofit journalism, and it's big in the United States. I wrote with another person the first code for nonprofit journalism because they have specific problems about. This is basically journalists leave the mainstream. There's no jobs. They're being cut back. They set up a website, an investigative unit, and they get money from funders and donations and crowdsourcing and all that. And you would say, well, that's never going to fly because someday the money will run out. Well, it hasn't. There are now many of those units, and they are local. They can be local, and they can supplement. And maybe that model. All I'm saying is maybe there's some models in here that can address which is very valuable.
Maybe just an additional corollary to that question. Today, the Canadian federal government has proposed, I believe it is a $600 million fund for shoring up media industries and journalism in Canada. I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Actually, I thought of that while he was asking the question, but thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested in what you think about that. I mean, on some cases, you would say, well, hang on, how is that money going to be strings attached to that money? Of course, you should ask that question. But if it can be applied in some sort of independent fashion, bravo. I would, but I have to see the details.
Hello. Just because you were identifying occupiers, would you see the monopolization of journalism, like massive industries owning newspapers and broadcasting companies, as an occupier?
Not necessarily. I mean, there can be large news organizations that can do very good journalism, like the New York Times, in my opinion. Okay, but it's any degree of concentration can lead to where, in fact, bad journalism, if it's practiced, can have a dramatic effect. So if you have a chain of newspapers or a chain of big chain of broadcasts, all donate, all sort of devoted to the most sensational sort of fake advice, yeah, that's a problem because you can't get your voice, other voices in there. I mean, if you look at commercial AM radio in some countries, it's nothing but hot talk, and they're all owned by 3 or 4 organizations. So yes, it is a possibility. But I don't necessarily assume that because somebody's big that they're bad, and that I think that what you need in a country is a great plurality of types of media ownership. We need, yes, public broadcast, and we need online stuff. We need rural, and we need various countries. When I was working in journalism, you could almost say that the situation was almost worse. If you didn't want to work for a few, 3 or 4 news organizations which owned most of the newspapers and most of the public broadcasters, or if you pissed off some of them, you'd be hard-pressed to find a job in Canada in journalism. So I'm not saying it's better now. I'm just saying the problem of ownership has always been there for journalists. It happened in the late 1800s when journalism became a business and journalism became folded into big newsrooms. Well, they're really factories. They were factories. They were huge, that operated according to deadlines, certain product fashioned in a certain way, and so on and so forth. And while journalists got criticism for becoming big and powerful, they then invented journalism ethics, 1920. They started creating codes of ethics. Why? Because the public was saying, why should we trust you, big, powerful, priestly class of journalists? Why? Same as people do today, right? And why should we trust you if your owner, Mr. Hearst, or whomever, in fact, wants to elect the president, right? And wants to start a war with Cuba, right? And so in many ways, journalists, upon themselves, not with their owners, sort of blessing, created associations. In every society, journalism society across our country and across the United States, so on, developed a code of ethics to try to reassure the public that, in fact, despite our embodiment in a factory of news, that, in fact, we could still be ethical. And that battle, of course, is still raging. Can journalists be ethical in those forms of environment? It's always been. Journalism from the 1600s has battled to be respected and in fact, ethical. And I suspect it will be tomorrow.
We have another question. Stephen, you okay with a couple more questions?
Mm-hmm.
This again.
I just got to keep drinking the water.
A question from our live stream audience: are the more successful populists, under your simpler meaning, almost necessarily demagogues as well, i.e., engaging in simplistic demagoguery?
No. You can be a genuine populist who wants to reform, say, unemployment laws or any particular laws in society, and you're not doing being a demagogue. The negative meaning of demagogue is where I'm an insincere populist. I'm basically using these simple slogans and solutions and catching the emotions of the people for my own good to gain power. I don't really give a about the people, but man, it's convenient to appeal to them. Huh? That's the charlatans trick for ever. So yeah, I mean, I think that there are great, good journalists. There's bad public oratory and great, everyone talks about. Perhaps you don't know about there was, in the United States in the 30s, there was a lot of authoritarian and left-wing and right-wing populism. And people say, well, we're all scared of them becoming demagogues. But no one's really particularly was that concerned with the oratory skills of Churchill in dark hours. And Reverend Luther King was an incredible, not a demagogue in that sense, in my view, and so it's good and bad. One of the things that you have to watch out for in the history of populism is elite backlash. The elite portrayal of populism is necessarily a worrisome, harmful thing. This has happened throughout. It happened in Athens, everyone feared Cleon, and so on and so forth. But it happened, the U.S. founding fathers drawing up the Constitution were explicitly, for all the talk of we the people, were really concerned about not too much populism, right? Not too much, right? The legislatures are going to elect senators. We don't want, and we're going to have an electoral college make sure the people who may go wrong, right, need to be corrected. There's a fear of populism all through history, and in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the conservatives and the liberals in Europe and elsewhere began to fear mass democracy. And so they wanted to portray mass democracy as rule of the mob way back then. And you got people like Gustave Le Bon, you got a whole bunch of other writers, José Gasset, here comes the mob. And it was this reaction. And so that's what I'm saying is that when you look at populism, you have to look at the specific person and ideology involved. Don't just dismiss them because they happen to be popular. They may actually be genuine.
Other questions? Duncan?
We could ask a dozen, but here's the question I have for you. You're talking about populists, and I want to bring it right to Trump. Because of Trump, we've got some wonderful examples of great investigative journalism that has gone on. The one that jumps to mind is 18 months by the New York Times looking deep into the whole finances of the family and all of that. Story lasted 2 days. So my question is, to what extent do you think the media is failing in the way it covers Trump?
They're not all failing, but those, the sort of the structural weakness, number one, starts with this tweet, with using their tweets, every tweet as your news agenda for the day, to the point where President Trump, you can call him America media's assignment. He basically, lots of people simply take those tweets and turn a story. I think there's other ways to deal with them. I won't go on with it right now, how you deal with that. The second one is simply playing sort of the balance game, where you want to balance up his views, views that are, that need to be criticized, and we fall back on that. I think there is a large score of organizations in the United States that are trying hard to break the truth and to break some interesting information. But here's the problem. In a polarized society, and you are characterized as a liberal media outfit, that's the New York. The other half of the population won't read you, and they won't accept what you say as a fact. So if tomorrow, New York Times, I don't care what your politics, actually comes up with an investigative story of criminal wrongdoing by the president, they've got it nailed down 6 ways to heaven, right? I mean, they've got facts, they've got everything. I will tell you that there would be how many? 30, 40% of Americans that would simply say that's just the liberal media. So what is the good of producing facts when people won't listen, when they're so ideologically rigid? So that's my concern with democracy right now. If you ask me, where is this all leading the United States? I say I have no crystal ball, but I know it will end bad. I'm not sure, but my intuition on this is that this will be a constitutional crisis of some kind down the road, and democracy of the American people and their legislatures for democracy will be tested. It's already being. So I'm sort of, the glass is half empty, and glasses, or whatever the old metaphor is, it's half empty, half full, whatever the heck it is. I'm pushing for reform. I'm pushing desperately to get people to join in a sort of movement to save egalitarian democracy, as I call it. At the same time, I'm not at all Pollyannish that this is going to work. But hope so. Hopefully.
Thanks very much for your talk. And this is sort of related to what you were just talking about, how 30 to 40% of the populace may not believe. In fact, you were talking about a registry of reliable and unreliable sources. And how would that work when you have, as you said, 40% of the population who either wouldn't even know that this registry exists, or they have their own registry that's saying the New York Times is.
That's right.
And so.
That's right. I think it has more chance in Canada. I think, and in some countries which are not so polarized. But if you get into a country that's so polarized as it is now in the United States, I agree. It is a huge conundrum. You can say, well, maybe if we get it into the schools earlier enough, we can get to the people and so on and so forth. Yeah, I hope so. I really, I'm not giving up in the United States. I have great respect for all those people down there and the citizens and all that. But I just don't know how they're going to get out of the situation they're in, locked into this us versus them. What you would need is that enough centrists, enough moderates on both sides would come together and say enough and start doing some other type of politics, some other type of media, so on and so forth. Is that going to happen? I don't know. The midterms were, you can see it good or bad. The good way was, at least for my politics, I'm happy more Democrats got elected. Guess my politics, right? I'm happy the more women got elected. You still have a Senate, Congress, still have people in society. I don't know. The problem is, the Greeks had this theory that some democracies are born to decline. They naturally decline into tyranny. I hope that's not
Any other questions from the audience? No? Okay. Well, I think we can. Stephen, you want to cover any more slides? You good?
I'm good.
You're good. Okay. I think I'll come up here and we'll bring this this lecture, this talk to a close. I do want to express our gratitude one more time. Please join me in thanking Stephen Ward for his time and his excellent talk this evening.
Thank you.
And on behalf of the students and faculty and the Department of Journalism and Communications here at St. Thomas and the Fredericton community and the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, thank you so much for attending tonight.
And thank you for supporting me. Thank you.